If there was one thing my grandmother always said, it was that the world just needed a little more kindness. And for her and my grandfather, that kindness always came in the form of paws, wagging tails, and grateful purrs. For as long as I can remember, my grandparents have rescued abandoned animals, dogs, cats, sometimes even rabbits, and birds that someone has left to die. They're not hoarders, not at all. Each animal that passes through their hands receives care, food, affection, and, eventually, a new home. But until that time comes, my grandparents look after them as if they were part of the family. So when they called me in a panic, saying that a woman from the HOA was trying to force them to stop rescuing and threatening to evict them, I knew immediately that hell was about to break loose in the neighborhood. The HOA of the condominium where they lived has always been a nest of people who believe that a white picket fence and a well-trimmed lawn are more important than any other aspect of life. It was always a nuisance, but nothing that affected my grandparents' routine too much. Until, apparently, one of the association's new leaders decided that the neighborhood's biggest problem wasn't the teenagers who sped their cars down the street, or the neighbors who threw noisy parties until the early hours of the morning, or even that guy who clearly didn't clean up his dog's poop on the sidewalk. The big problem in the neighborhood was two elderly people looking after abandoned animals. And that's how Karen, because, of course, that was her name, knocked on my grandparents' door with a piece of paper in her hand and the arrogance of someone who thinks they can control other people's lives. The document, according to my grandmother, was an official notice warning them that they were violating the condominium rules by keeping an excessive number of animals and disfiguring the aesthetics of the neighborhood with a makeshift kennel. Improvised kennel. The woman was referring to a covered balcony, well-kept and equipped with beds and food bowls, where my grandparents kept a maximum of 3 or 4 dogs at a time. But for the queen of the HOA, that was an unforgivable affront. The notice also said that if my grandparents didn't remove the animals within a week, they would be fined. If the fines piled up, they could face legal action, including eviction, from an elderly couple who have lived in the neighborhood longer than this woman has probably lived in the state. My grandmother tried to argue. She tried to explain that the animals were never loose, that they never caused any problems, that they were all vaccinated and cleaned, that, in fact, their work helped the neighborhood because it prevented abandoned dogs and cats from roaming the streets. But do you think someone who cares more about the color of their neighbor's curtains than the life of a living being would care about that? Karen limited herself to repeating the robotic speech of someone who thinks that rules are more important than common sense. My grandparents were devastated. They never asked anyone for anything. They never did any work. All they did was help. And now they had a week to decide between abandoning a job they had dedicated their lives to or facing absurd consequences. And that's when they called me. Now, here's something Karen didn't know. I'm not just a guy who likes animals. I'm the founder of the largest animal rescue organization in the city, with thousands of followers, supporters, and volunteers. I have contacts with journalists, lawyers, and politicians. And if she thought she was going to get rid of my grandparents with a stupid letter and a ridiculous fine, then this woman was about to learn the hard way that she had messed with the wrong people. You know, the kind of people who have never been contradicted in their lives and think that the whole world revolves around their own navel? That was Karen. The woman really believed that a piece of paper signed by half a dozen unoccupied neighbors was going to make my grandparents give up everything they loved. She thought that because she was part of the HOA, she had the absolute power to dictate who could and couldn't exist in the condominium. But there was one small detail she didn't take into account: me. When my grandmother called me, crying, saying that she didn't know what to do, that they just wanted to keep helping the animals, and that they were being treated like criminals, my patience died right there. At that very moment, I knew that Karen was going to regret every last fiber of her body for having tried to mess with the wrong people. The first thing I did, I mobilized my animal rescue organization. I picked up the phone, called some volunteers, and explained the situation. In less than an hour, there was a group ready to take action. The first step was to spread the story. Then I wrote a detailed post about the situation. I used photos of my grandparents, two lovely old people who dedicated their lives to helping animals, and explained that they were being threatened by a residents' association that saw problems where none existed. And that's when the magic of the internet began to work. The post went viral. It started with a few local shares, then influencers from the animal cause started reposting, and in less than 24 hours, the story was all over the city. People were furious. The general public doesn't like to see injustice, and when that injustice involves the elderly and defenseless animals, the effect is multiplied 1,000-fold. The comments were a massacre. How can an HOA be so mean? These seniors are only helping. Your grandparents need legal support. I'm a lawyer, and I can help for free. Does anyone have a press contact? This needs to be exposed. And that's when the bomb went off. Because, while Karen thought she was only dealing with two helpless elderly people, in reality, she had just picked a fight with an entire community passionate about animal rescue. And the press came down hard. The next day, a reporter from one of the biggest local newspapers sent me a message asking for an interview. I accepted on the spot. The story was brutal for the HOA. It featured photos of my grandparents, moving accounts from neighbors who said they were the best residents in the neighborhood, prints of the absurd notifications Karen had sent. And then came the final blow, a video of one of the dogs my grandparents had rescued, a golden retriever who had been found in a deplorable state, but who, thanks to them, was now healthy and full of life. The impact was immediate. Public opinion turned into a tsunami against Karen and the HOA. The comments on the association's Facebook page were a festival of curses. People called the HOA demanding explanations. The image of the condominium, once a peaceful and respectable place, became synonymous with cruelty and pointless bureaucracy. And then, finally, Karen realized that she was screwed. But instead of backing down and admitting her mistake, she doubled down. She made a post trying to justify herself, saying that the rules existed for a reason, that street animals posed a risk to public health, and that the welfare of residents should be a priority. If her intention was to try to clean up her own image, she achieved exactly the opposite. Because now, people were furious and knew exactly who was responsible. Her name started appearing in posts, in memes, in hate-filled comments. People started tagging the companies that worked with the HOA, saying that they wouldn't support anyone who was involved with such a cruel policy. Some residents of the condominium itself, who had previously kept quiet, began to speak out against Karen. The woman who thought she was the queen of the neighborhood was seeing her little empire crumble before her eyes. But I wasn't finished yet, because now it was time to take this story to the legal side. And I already had a plan to make sure that Karen and her HOA paid dearly for all of this. The most fascinating thing about people like Karen is that they always think they can intimidate anyone. The concept of consequences simply doesn't exist for these people. They shout, send threatening letters, hand out fines as if they were party favors, and expect everyone to bow their heads and obey. But then, one fine day, they come across someone who not only won't put their head down, but turns the situation into a giant problem for them. That was me. With the internet on fire, the press covering the case and public opinion turning the HOA and Karen into symbols of absolute evil, it was time to tighten the noose even more. First, I called in a lawyer specializing in property rights and animal protection, because, contrary to what Karen thought, the HOA didn't have absolute power over the residents. My grandfather owned the house and hadn't signed any contract banning temporary animals. Second, I gathered witnesses. Neighbors who loved my grandparents began to speak up. Some, previously intimidated by the HOA, decided it was time to expose the atrocities of this condominium dictatorship. And, believe me, what started out as a case of injustice against animal rescues turned into a full-blown dossier on HOA abuses over the years. Stories of ridiculous fines, threats of eviction for absurd things like the wrong color curtains, and even cases of discrimination against older residents have come to light. What was once an isolated case became a scandal about a rotten system. And then, the best part, money. Nothing terrifies an HOA more than the possibility of losing money. And what happens when a condo starts to get a horrible reputation? Properties lose value. People avoid buying houses there. The real estate market takes a step back and begins to wonder if it's worth dealing with all that garbage. The residents themselves began to complain that the HOA was ruining their reputation. Some even threatened to file class action lawsuits against the association. Karen, who used to be just a shifty neighborhood trustee, was now feeling the weight of it all fall on her. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared this woman for the final blow. Because I had a trump card in my pocket, the support of local political figures. As the founder of a well-known animal rescue organization, I had already worked with local councillors and MPs on awareness campaigns and animal protection bills. And guess what? Some of them loved the opportunity to get involved in this mess and score some points with the public. One councilman posted a video supporting my grandparents and condemning the HOA. Another suggested an official investigation into the association's practices. At this point, Karen wasn't just an annoying woman trying to put an end to animal rescue. She had become a national joke, a symbol of everything that's wrong with people who treat idiotic rules as divine commandments. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for, the desperate backlash. The HOA, realizing it was sinking fast, made a formal announcement saying it would reconsider the decision against my grandparents. But now it was too late for simple backtracking. Because it wasn't just about withdrawing the threat. I wanted them to pay for it. And I was about to ensure just that. If Karen had any sense at all, she would have accepted defeat and got on with her life. She could have simply apologized, retreated, and tried to live out the rest of her days in suburban anonymity. But no, people like her don't know when to stop. After the HOA's generic statement trying to pretend that it was all a big misunderstanding, the residents of the neighborhood split into two groups, those who wanted distance from the scandal and those who were ready to set fire, metaphorical of course, to the condominium's management. And it wasn't just because of my grandparents. The whole thing exposed a pattern of abuse that went far beyond animal rescues. People who had previously kept quiet began to speak out. An elderly couple revealed that, the previous year, they had been threatened with fines because their grandson played on the sidewalk with colored chalk, polluting the aesthetics of the neighborhood. Another resident said she had received a notice because her window curtain was not in the color palette recommended by the regulations. And then came the financial problems. When the HOA found itself under pressure, it began to back down and release information in an attempt to calm tempers. But this only made things worse. Suddenly, everyone wanted to see the association's financial records. The annual fees were sky-high and were supposed to be used for neighborhood maintenance. But then someone asked the question no one wanted to answer. Where was the money? The children's playground was falling apart. The street lamps had been burnt out for months. And the maintenance seemed to be ghosts, because no one could remember the last time a really useful service was done with that money. The HOA tried to keep everything under wraps, claiming that they weren't obliged to divulge the financial details to anyone. But now the problem was no longer a small group of people complaining. It was practically the whole neighborhood demanding answers. And that's when Karen began to feel the ground disappearing from under her feet. The first thing that happened was predictable. Karen began to disappear. If before she had walked around the neighborhood with that air of superiority, now she avoided leaving the house. She didn't answer messages. She didn't show up at HOA meetings. And, most importantly, she couldn't control the narrative anymore. Because by now, I had made sure that my grandparents' story went beyond the city. My animal rescue organization had connections with NGOs and public figures, and they were outraged by what had happened. The newspapers began to cover the case even more intensely. And suddenly, Karen was no longer just a nosy neighbor. She was a symbol of the arrogance of HOAs who abuse their power. Stories began to come out about how associations like this were taking away the peace and quiet of residents in various parts of the country. Reports emerged from other cities where elderly people were threatened, families were evicted for ridiculous reasons, all because a small group of people thought they could rule a neighborhood, as if it were a medieval monarchy. And Karen? Well, she didn't know how to deal with it. First, he tried to delete his social networks. But the internet doesn't forget. Profiles started circulating prints of her posts, old comments where she clearly showed her contempt for anyone who didn't fit the ideal resident standard she envisioned. Then came the legal desperation. I received an email from her lawyer asking for a friendly meeting. They wanted to discuss the possibility of a settlement to end any legal action against the HOA. I laughed so hard when I read that I almost choked on my coffee. The HOA wanted a settlement? After almost evicting my grandparents? After destroying their peace by simply helping abandoned animals? I called my lawyer and told him to answer with a simple, "See you in court." The hearing was a spectacle worthy of a live broadcast. Karen, who had always felt so powerful in the neighborhood, was now sitting in the dock next to the HOA's lawyers. The lawsuit we filed was clear: bullying, abuse of power, and emotional harm against my grandparents. The HOA's lawyers tried to argue that they were just applying the rules, that it was nothing personal, that they didn't know the situation would take such a turn. The judge had no patience for that. I presented every document, every printout, every testimony from residents who were victims of this association's ridiculous practices. The defense lawyer even tried to say that everything was being exaggerated because I was a public figure and had used my influence to amplify the case. But it was at that moment that the judge looked at Karen and asked, "Do you admit to threatening this elderly couple with eviction?" Karen hesitated. She tried to play it off. But the video of my grandmother crying while holding one of the rescued dogs was enough to bury any chance of an argument. In the end, the verdict was clear. Karen lost. The HOA was ordered to pay considerable compensation to my grandparents. The court ruled that the association would have to revise all of its rules and implement external oversight to prevent abuses in the future. And Karen? Expelled from the HOA. Her own neighbors demanded that she be removed from the board. And since the scandal was ruining the neighborhood's reputation, the pressure was too much. She became a pariah in her own condominium. And to top it all off, we found out months later that she had to sell the house and move. To where? Nobody knows. Nobody cares. My grandparents continue with the rescues. In fact, now they have even more support. After all this exposure, donations started pouring in. People volunteered. They, who used to do everything themselves, now have a small group of helpers who ensure that no animal goes hungry or cold in the neighborhood. And what about me? Well, I've never missed a chance to drive past the house where Karen used to live and park my car on the street, just for symbolism. I know she'll never see it. I know she'll never make anyone's life hell there again. But still, every time I stop there, I look at the passenger seat, where one of the dogs rescued by my grandparents is looking at me with his tongue hanging out and his tail wagging. And I think, in the end, good always wins. And if you also think that good always prevails in the end, don't forget to leave your like and comment on what you thought of the video. See you later.